It was one of those quiet Tuesday mornings when the sky looked undecided, half covered in clouds, half tempting sunlight.
I
I had a few service calls lined up, nothing out of the ordinary. The third job on my list was a standard drain clog in a small neighborhood on the edge of town. I'd been doing handyman work long enough to know that most calls weren't really about the work. Sometimes it was about fixing a cabinet. Other times it was about being the first person someone had spoken to in days. I didn't think much of it when I pulled into the driveway. House was tidy, modest, pale blue with white trim. Few wilted potted plants sat by the step, signs of effort, maybe forgotten or maybe just overwhelmed. I rang the bell and waited, clipboard in hand, tool bag on my shoulder. She opened the door after a moment, standing there with a faint smile and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than she let on. She looked about mid-40s, dressed in casual house clothes, hair tied loosely back, no makeup. The kind of look someone wears when they're no longer trying to impress anyone, but still care enough not to appear careless. She stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. Her voice was kind, controlled. She said the kitchen sink was backed up again, that it had happened more than once lately. I told her I'd take a look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kitchen was spotless but quiet. No music playing, no hum of a dishwasher, just the faint ticking of a wall clock and the occasional groan of a pipe. I crouched down under the sink, flipping on my headlamp and starting with the usual checks. She stayed nearby but didn't hover. From time to time I could feel her eyes on me, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how or whether. She should. The drain was in worse shape than expected. Grease buildup, maybe years' worth, hardened over time into something stubborn. I told her it might take a while. She just nodded, as if time wasn't something she needed to worry about. As I worked, I glanced at her shoes near the doorway, 3 pairs, neatly aligned. A pair of flats, some garden clogs, and a pair of men's sneakers that looked barely worn. I noticed things like that. You kind of had to in my line of work. It wasn't just about what needed fixing it. It was about who lived in the house and who no longer did. Eventually, as I twisted the pipe free and set the bucket underneath, she leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. Her voice was quieter than before, almost absent-minded. She said, "You know, in all the years I was married, my husband never fixed anything." It wasn't an accusation, not even bitterness. It's just a simple fact that floated into the space between us like steam off a cup of tea. I didn't look up right away. Sometimes people say things like that, not because they want a response, but because the silence has gotten too loud. I let the words hang there while I scraped out the sludge and replaced the trap. When I finally stood and wiped my hands, she was looking not at me, but out the window above the sink. Her eyes were distant, fixed on something I couldn't see. I asked quietly if she wanted the bathroom checked too, just in case. She blinked, then nodded slowly. I think we both knew the clog wasn't the only thing she needed cleared. I ended up staying longer than usual. The bathroom drain was clear, but I ran a flush test anyway. She brought me a glass of water without asking, and we ended up talking. Lightly at first, she told me about the house, how she'd lived in it for nearly 15 years. Most of that time with someone who was present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. She didn't go into detail, and I didn't pry. But the way she described the little things leaky faucets left for weeks. Burnt-out bulbs she had to replace herself, squeaky doors he never oiled it, painted a picture of a woman who had long learned to rely on no one. And not because she wanted to, but because she had to. That line she said earlier, it echoed louder the more I looked around. The men's sneakers by the door, the untouched second half of the closet I glimpsed when she fetched a towel. Her life still carried the outline of someone who'd left her faded slowly away. And yet here she was, functioning, composed, but with this quiet grief hidden under the surface like rust in the pipes. And I wondered, not for the first time, maybe this was why I kept getting these kinds of calls. There's a certain weight people carry when they've spent years feeling unseen. And hers became more visible the longer I was in that house. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It showed up in the way she stood with one arm crossed across her stomach, guarding herself even when she wasn't aware. It showed in the way she offered coffee with a smile but apologized for not having cream like it mattered. The kind of woman who had spent more time worrying about inconveniencing others than allowing herself to be comforted. As I sat at her kitchen table, letting my tools dry off beside me, I took in more details: family photos on the fridge where she stood beside a man who looked like he was already halfway out the door. A calendar stuck on a month 2 years ago. A small pile of unopened mail that looked too neatly stacked to be accidental. I didn't ask about the man. The way she'd said "my husband" made it sound like a chapter already closed. The kind of thing you reference because it shaped you, not because you miss it. And yet you could feel it in the house, the quiet longing for someone to finally meet her halfway. To pick up a wrench, change a bulb, or just notice when the faucet never stopped dripping. She sat across from me and began to talk, not in the way someone tells a story, but like someone finally giving voice to the silence they've been living with. She said things I didn't expect. That she had once tried to learn how to fix things herself, watching YouTube videos at 1 a.m. with a flashlight in her mouth and a toolbox borrowed from her neighbor. That she had once clogged the toilet while replacing a flapper valve and spent 3 hours trying to reverse the damage before calling a plumber in tears. That when she finally asked her husband for help, he told her she was making it dramatic. She told me about the cracked tile in the bathroom that she covered with a rug, about the leaky garage roof that she paid for in installments because he didn't believe it was worth fixing. And as she spoke, her voice didn't shake, but her eyes held a storm, just barely held back. It wasn't about the things not being fixed. It was about what it represented, about not being worth the effort. About being surrounded by broken things, and the only person in the room who noticed was herself. She confessed that it had taken her a long time to realize how deeply that resentment had settled into her bones. How every unfinished task became a reminder that her needs were secondary. How even now, years later, she still hesitated before asking for help because somewhere along the way, asking had become a form of failure, and it broke something in me, hearing her say that. I'd been in dozens of homes like this, met dozens of people who lived with similar ghosts. But there was something about the way she spoke, not bitter, not pitiful, just honest, that made me want to stay longer than the job required. Not out of obligation. Out of a quiet need to counter the narrative she had carried alone for too long. I told her that the drain would need a chemical flush in addition to the manual work I'd done. I could come back the next day to follow up, just to be sure. She smiled, soft, tentative, the kind that hides behind years of doubt. I told her there was no charge for the follow-up. Her thanks was barely audible, but she looked at me like it meant more than she wanted to admit. When I left that afternoon, the air had shifted. The snow had started to fall lightly, catching on my windshield as I pulled away, but I wasn't in a rush. I found myself thinking about her house more than usual, about the silence inside, the warmth in the kitchen, the way she said "my husband" never fixed anything, like she had only recently accepted it as truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing her hunched under a sink at midnight, trying to fix a problem alone, not because she wanted to, but because no one else would. And I realized something else: people like her didn't want saving. They just wanted someone who noticed. Someone who stayed long enough to care, even after the problem was technically solved. I thought about the way she brewed coffee, carefully, avoiding eye contact when she offered it, like even kindness had become a transaction she had to earn. And maybe that was what stayed with me most, that someone could be so strong, so capable, and still carry the quiet ache of always having to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next day I returned with a new part for the trap and the chemical flush she needed. The job took less than 20 minutes, but I stayed longer. She offered me coffee again this time, with cream. She'd picked some up just in case. I sat at her table while the solution worked its way through the pipes. We talked again, not about broken things this time, but about ordinary ones. Her garden, the stray cat that sometimes slept on her porch, the book she started last spring and still hadn't finished. I noticed the photo frame on the counter had changed. What was once a picture of her and her husband was now a landscape shot of a beach. A small thing, but meaningful. like she had begun rewriting her space, one object at a time. I told her the drain should be fine now, that she probably wouldn't have another issue for a while. She nodded but didn't rush me out. We sat there a little longer, the silence not heavy this time but comfortable. Before I left, she said something that stuck with me. She said it felt good to have someone show up and actually follow through. That most people these days just did what they were paid for and left. I didn't say much to that. I just told her I'd be around if anything else came up. But as I walked out, I realized I meant it more than I expected. And somehow, I had a feeling this wasn't going to be the last time I found myself on her doorstep over the next week. I kept thinking about her not in the way that distracts you, but in the way that lingers, like a familiar song you didn't know you had memorized. Every little thing reminded me of her quiet resilience. A cracked window in another client's home made me remember how she'd gently run her hand over a similar one in her guest bedroom and said, "It's been like that for years." A faded calendar on someone else's wall made me think of the one frozen in her kitchen, still marking a month-long past. I hadn't planned to return, not unless she called, but by the fourth day. I found myself driving through her neighborhood again, my lunch break stretching longer than usual. There wasn't any real excuse to stop by, so I didn't. I just passed. Her house slowly noted the light in the kitchen window and kept going. That evening, she messaged me nothing major, just a note that the bathroom sink had started draining slowly, and could I take a quick look if I had time. I had time. I made time. The next morning, I was back at her door, toolbox in hand. Trying not to look like I was too eager to be there, she opened the door with a familiar soft smile. But this time it carried less caution, like she had decided I wasn't a stranger anymore. The bathroom sink job was simple, something I could have talked her through over the phone. But I was glad she hadn't asked me to. It gave us another excuse to talk. She made coffee again, and this time sat with me while I worked. The conversation came easier now. She told me about her job, how she used to teach writing classes at the community center before they cut the funding, how she'd published a few essays in online magazines that no one in her family ever read. She spoke about her mother, now gone, who used to fix everything around the house when she was growing up, and how she used to sit on the edge of the tub, watching her mother tighten bolts and repair tile like it was second nature. It looked so easy, she said, and I could tell that memory carried both pride and pain. I finished the job in under 10 minutes, but we ended up talking for an hour. She didn't rush me. I didn't offer to leave. When I finally stood up, she thanked me not just for the work, but for listening. I told her she made it easy. As the days passed, the jobs kept appearing. A loose drawer here, a flickering light there, door hinge that creaked every time the wind blew. Little things, nothing urgent. But each fix became a thread, weaving me more deeply into the fabric of her life. It was never about the repairs, not really. It was about presence. About someone showing up and staying long enough to notice the details others overlooked. One afternoon, she invited me to help her in the backyard where a pile of fallen branches had been gathering near the fence. The sun was warm for once, and the yard smelled of dry earth and lavender. We worked side by side in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging short stories about our lives. I learned that she had no children by choice, a decision she said was half hers and half circumstance. Her voice didn't waver when she spoke. But there was a pause before she changed the subject that told me the story went deeper. We didn't push past that pause. Instead, we gathered the branches and stacked them neatly, and when we were done, she brought out lemonade and sat beside me on the porch steps, like it was something we'd done for years. There was something so unassuming about the way she let me into her world. It was never dramatic or confessional. It was steady, like the way a tree grows slow, quiet, deeply rooted. And I noticed changes in her, subtle but certain. The house started to shift. The calendar on the fridge was updated. The picture of her and her husband was gone completely. I didn't ask when or why. I just noticed the space it left behind had been filled with a hand-drawn quote she'd pinned up that read, "Strong things grow in silence." Her laugh came easier, too. Once I teased her about the fact that her garden tools were better organized than my toolbox, and she laughed this. Short, surprised sound like she hadn't heard herself do it in a long time. And maybe she hadn't. Her energy was still cautious, but it was no longer locked away. She began making small plans, talking about repainting the guest room, clearing out the attic, maybe even signing up to teach again if the center reopened. These weren't declarations, they were breadcrumbs, soft signs of someone beginning to imagine a different future. And though she never said it, I knew the repairs had very little to do with screws and bolts. The shift wasn't just in her hit. It was in me too. I started looking forward to her messages in a way that surprised me. I found myself double-checking my shirt before knocking on her door, making sure my boots weren't muddy even if I was coming straight from another job. I caught myself thinking about what she'd think of a song on the radio or a story a client had told me. I realized I wasn't just showing up to fix her house. I was showing up because I wanted to be part of her days, to be someone who made her life a little lighter. There was a comfort in the rhythm we had created her making. Coffee, me working quietly, our conversations growing in depth and ease with each visit. And somewhere in that rhythm, I began to feel something deeper take root. Something that had nothing to do with handyman work and everything to do with connection. Not the flashy, immediate kind, but the kind you build one quiet moment at a time. And for the first time in a long while, I found myself hoping that the next message wouldn't be about a repair at all but just her. Reaching out because she wanted me there. A few days after we cleared her backyard, I got a message from her in the early afternoon. She said she'd tried to hang a floating shelf in the living room and ended up with a crooked board and 3 extra holes in the wall. I could have laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I told her I'd swing by later that day if she was home. She said she was. Of course she was. When I arrived, she was barefoot, wearing a soft gray sweater that hung off one shoulder, and her hair was tied up like she'd been too busy or too tired to finish getting ready. The shelf sat on the floor beside a half-empty toolbox and a box of screws. She looked sheepish, embarrassed even, but not defeated. There was something charming about it's someone who had spent so long doing everything alone, finally letting herself ask for help, even when she'd tried first. I fixed the shelf in under 20 minutes, using a level and proper anchors. She watched from the couch, sipping tea, and when I was done, she smiled and said, "It's probably the straightest thing in this house now." We both laughed, and in that moment, I felt the room shift again, something unspoken, something kind. She started telling me more stories, not just about her house, but about her life before it. She talked about her early 20s, how she'd traveled alone across parts of Europe with a backpack and a journal, how she once slept on a train station bench in Prague because she missed the last departure, and how that night taught her she could handle anything. I listened more than I spoke. She had this quiet fire inside her, one that had never quite gone out even when everything around her seemed cold. As she spoke, I started to notice how she leaned in more when she laughed, how her eyes softened. When she talked about books she used to love but hadn't read in years, I asked her why she stopped. She shrugged and said, "I guess I got busy surviving." That line stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true in the way only lived-in truths are. She had been surviving fixing things alone, holding her own spine up, being both the problem solver and the one who had to sleep in the bed of unresolved mess. She hadn't been waiting for someone to fix her world. She just hadn't had anyone who'd offer to sit in it with her. It became a pattern. I'd stop by to check on something: leaky faucet, squeaky cabinet, a jammed door, and we'd end up talking. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. I never billed her for those visits, even though I easily could have. Truth was, they didn't feel like work anymore. It felt like a part of my life I didn't know I was missing. She started opening the door with a cup of coffee already in her hand, sometimes with cinnamon, sometimes plain, always hot. Her eyes looked lighter, her posture more at ease. The house began to look different tonight, in a renovated way, but in spirit. Curtains were pulled back to let in more light. Books reappeared on the side table. A vase of fresh flowers stood. In the middle of the kitchen island, even when no one else would see them, she was reclaiming her space. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she finally had the energy to care again. And somewhere along the way, I realized that fixing things for her had started fixing something in me too. I hadn't felt useful in that kind of way in years, not the kind where someone's relief feels like home. One afternoon, while I was patching a corner of drywall where the old towel rack had torn loose, she brought up her marriage again. Not directly, but like a thread she wanted to pull on a little more. She said there had been good years, even fun years, but that the real breakdown didn't happen all at once. It came in quiet waves, forgotten anniversaries, dismissive glances, arguments about nothing that lasted too long. She said what broke her most wasn't the cheating, or the indifference, or even the loneliness. It was the moment she realized she stopped expecting anything at all. When she stopped asking for help because she knew the answer before she heard it. That was when she knew the marriage had ended, long before the paperwork said it did. I stopped what I was doing and just sat with her. I didn't offer advice. I didn't judge. I just listened. Because sometimes what people need most isn't a solution. It's a witness. And as she stared at the patch on the wall, she added, almost as an afterthought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life expecting nothing. It was the most hopeful thing I'd ever heard from someone who had been let down so many times. After that day, something subtle but meaningful shifted between us. She started calling me by name more often, said it softer, like it had weight now. She began texting not just about housework, but things she'd seen, songs she remembered, little jokes that made her laugh. I responded every time. I couldn't help it. I found myself thinking about her even when I was buried in other jobs. Her laugh, the way she stirred her tea counterclockwise like it mattered. The way her voice dipped when she talked about her past. There was no declaration, no dramatic moment. Just the steady unfolding of two people moving toward each other without needing to say it. She wasn't asking me to rescue her. She didn't need that. She just wanted to be seen, to be heard, and maybe if the space felt safe enough to be held one day, not just in arms but in presence. And without realizing it, I had started offering her that, slowly, quietly, one visit at a time. It was a Thursday morning when I realized I hadn't heard from her in 5 days. Not that I expected a message, but after the pattern we had quietly built, the silence felt louder than usual. I tried to convince myself that maybe everything was fine, that she was busy, or out of town, or maybe just needed space. But the truth was, I'd grown used to her presence in my life. Even if it was just in short bursts of conversation and soft laughter over coffee. That quiet connection had become something I looked forward to more than I'd let myself admit. The following day, I decided to pass by her place, not to push anything, just to see. I brought with me a small tool she'd mentioned needing for hanging curtain rods, as a kind of excuse. The neighborhood looked the same, calm and still under an overcast sky. Her car was in the driveway the same way it always was, but the blinds were drawn and something about the house felt sealed. I hesitated before ringing the doorbell. For a second, I wondered if I was crossing a line, showing up uninvited. But the door opened just as I raised my hand. She looked, surprised to see me, her hair unbrushed, sweater sleeves pulled down over her hands. Her expression was warm but tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in days. I asked if everything was all right, and she stepped aside to let me in without a word. The house was quiet, too quiet. No music playing, no coffee brewing, just the faint sound of the refrigerator and the air thick with something unspoken. Sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around a mug that was already empty. After a long pause, she told me she'd had a rough few days, that a friend from her past had passed away unexpectedly. They hadn't been close for years, but it had stirred something in her, a wave of grief she didn't know she'd still carry. She hadn't wanted to talk to anyone, hadn't wanted to explain why she felt so cracked open by something that, on paper, shouldn't hurt so much, but it did. And she didn't want to be seen that way. I listened and didn't try to fill the silence. I just sat across from her and stayed. We spent most of that visit in near silence. I offered to fix the bent curtain rod in her living room just to give her some space to breathe, and she nodded without looking up. As I worked, I could feel the heaviness in the room, not the kind that pushed people away, but the kind that drew you closer if you weren't afraid of it. I didn't say much, Just small updates about the curtain and how I'd adjust the bracket, so it wouldn't slip again. When I finished, I didn't ask for coffee. I just sat back down across from her and waited until she was ready to speak again. Eventually she did.
8.
She talked about how loss changes shape over time, how it softens, but never really leaves. How her marriage had ended years ago, but moments like this reminded her that absence doesn't always fade. Sometimes it just hides in the spaces we forget to check. She said she was glad I came by, that she probably wouldn't have reached out, but she didn't want to be alone either. That meant more to me than I could express, not because she needed me, but because she trusted me with her silence after that day. Our rhythm resumed, but something about it had deepened. The visits became less about repairs and more about presence. She'd ask for help with things that didn't need fixing right. Aware reorganizing shelves, checking loose steps on the porch, adjusting door frames. Small tasks, but each one an invitation. And I accepted every time. If I'd help her go through the boxes in her attic, things she hadn't touched since her divorce. We spent hours sifting through old clothes, photo albums, keepsakes she hadn't seen in years. Some made her laugh, so others made her pause, hold them in her lap like they still carried weight. I didn't pry. I just listened to the stories she offered as we worked. Slowly I saw her letting go, awed of the memories, but of the power they once held over her. We filled 2 donation boxes and a bag of things for the trash. When we climbed down from the attic, her eyes looked lighter. She thanked me, not just for the help, but for making the process easier. I wanted to tell her she made everything easier too, but I didn't. Not yet. By the end of that week, something unspoken passed between us, a kind of quiet closeness that didn't need to be named. We weren't rushing toward anything. There were no confessions, no dramatic turns. Just shared time, shared space, and the steady rebuilding of trust between 2 people who had lived too long in emotional isolation. I didn't know what would happen next, or how this would unfold. But I knew this much. She had let me into her world, not as a handyman, but as someone who stayed. And I had no intention of leaving, not unless she asked me to. And deep down, I didn't think she would. It was during one of our slower afternoons, no repairs. Just a cup of tea and a soft breeze drifting through the open back door, that I first noticed the flicker of doubt in her expression. We were sitting on the porch, both of us a little sun-warmed and quiet. She had just finished telling me about a college essay she'd once written on the symbolism of broken windows in literature. And we were both laughing at how dramatic it sounded now. But then her laughter slowed, and she looked out at the backyard, with a kind of detachment I hadn't seen in weeks. I waited, unsure if she was finished talking or if something heavier was coming. She finally said she'd run into someone the day before, an old friend who used to know her during the years. When her marriage was crumbling, this friend had asked her, "Are you seeing someone now?" Without thinking, she said no. It wasn't until later that she realized how quick she'd been to shut the door on the idea. "Even though you've been here," she added, without looking at me, "helping, showing up, talking." Then she said, more quietly, "I didn't know what to call it." That moment hung between us longer than anything else had. She wasn't fishing for a label. She wasn't even asking for clarity. She was just being honest about the weird space she now found herself in, somewhere between independence and attachment, gratitude and something more tender. I didn't rush to respond. I wanted to choose my words carefully, not out of fear, but respect. I told her I wasn't keeping count of how often I came over or how long we talked. That I hadn't planned any of this either, but it felt real. I was okay with it being undefined for now, as long as we both kept showing up. She didn't smile, but she relaxed a little, like she'd been holding her breath, and finally let it out. That night, I didn't linger. I left while the light was still soft and the sky was still gold, giving her the space to sit with whatever she needed to feel. And yet, the drive home was the quietest one I'd had in weeks. I kept playing the words over in my mind, not knowing what to call it, but knowing what it felt like. Familiar, honest, almost something. 2 days later, I got a call from a different client, someone who needed help with a rental property across town. I didn't think much of it until I pulled into the driveway and saw a familiar SUV already parked there. As it turned out, the woman who'd hired me was friends with her ex-husband's new partner. The moment she recognized my name, she started prying. Not maliciously, but with that polite curiosity people weaponize. She asked how I knew the ex, if I was still working on her house, whether she was doing all right. I gave short, professional answers, but inside I felt a chill. It wasn't embarrassment. It was protectiveness. She didn't deserve to be part of neighborhood gossip, and the idea that anyone was quietly watching her rebuild made my stomach turn. That night, I debated whether to tell her. In the end, I decided she deserved to know, gently. So the next day, I brought it up not to alarm her, but to let her know someone had noticed. She took it better than I expected. Her shoulders tensed. Sure, but she nodded slowly and said, I figured that might happen eventually. Then she added, I just didn't think it would bother me this much. That admission so small, so raw said everything. She had worked hard to carve out this quiet space for herself. And now, the idea that others might judge or misread what was happening here between us, even casually, made it harder for her to breathe in that space. I asked if she wanted me to stop coming by. For a while, to let things cool off. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water, stared out the window for a long time, then finally turned to me and said, No, I don't want to go back to pretending I don't need anyone. It wasn't a dramatic stand. It was a quiet, brave choice, one that made me feel more connected to her than any grand gesture ever could. From that point forward, I stopped caring what anyone else thought. I made a point to park right in front of her house instead of down the block. I rang the bell instead of texting from the driveway. We were no longer just fixing leaky sinks or patching drywall. We were fixing something else, something harder to name, but easier to feel. Not long after, she asked me if I'd ever consider helping her repaint the guest room, the one she used to avoid walking past. She said she wanted to turn it into a space for reading, maybe even writing again. The idea of that, of her reclaiming not just the room but her voice, moved me more than I let on. We picked out paint colors together one afternoon, debating between soft green and a warm oatmeal shade. She chose the oatmeal, but not before laughing at how midlife that sounded. And as I helped her prep the walls, cover the floors, and tape the corners, I found myself watching her more than working. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she stepped back and judged each stroke like it meant something. And it did. Every stroke was a statement. That she wasn't stuck in the past. That she was allowed to redefine comfort. She could rewrite the spaces she used to feel small in. And for some reason, she wanted me there to witness it. To help. To stand beside her not just as someone who fixes things, but someone who stays. The repainting of the guest room became more than just a weekend task. It turned into something almost ceremonial. She spent the days before I arrived clearing out old boxes from the corners and folding linens she hadn't touched in years. The walls, once a dull beige, looked almost apologetic, like they knew they'd been neglected. We worked slowly, not because it was hard, but because there was no reason to rush. Each roll of paint, each corner edged with careful precision, felt like reclaiming something. She played soft jazz from an old Bluetooth speaker, and at some point I caught myself humming along, the scent of fresh paint mixed with her lavender detergent. She laughed at how bad I was at cutting in the trim, and I teased her about putting too much pressure on the roller. It was light and playful, but underneath the laughter was something steady and growing. A comfort in the shared silence between jokes. When we finished, we sat on the floor of the freshly painted room, sipping cold water and staring at the drying walls. It feels like it can finally breathe in here, she said. I didn't say anything, I just nodded. But I knew she wasn't just talking about the room. That night, she asked if I'd stay for dinner. It was the first time. Nothing fancy. Just pasta, a simple salad, a bottle of wine, she said, had been sitting unopened for too long. I offered to help cook, and she handed me a chopping board with a grin. The kitchen felt different with two people moving inside it. It wasn't about coordination, but rhythm. She moved with ease, more relaxed than I'd ever seen her, and I matched her step without thinking. As the water boiled and garlic hit the oil, she told me more stories about how she once dreamed of opening a small cafe. She used to bake on Sunday mornings just because it made the house smell warm. She said she'd stopped doing that. After the divorce, it felt pointless, like making breakfast for a ghost, she whispered. Not in sadness, but with a kind of clarity that comes only from healing. Dinner was unhurried. We ate at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, the only light coming from the overhead lamp. There were no grand declarations, just two people who had both been alone too long, slowly learning how to share space. Again, as the dishes sat untouched in the sink, we moved to the living room, bringing our wine and quiet energy with us. She curled up on the end of the couch, and I sat in the worn armchair across from her. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing against the windows like distant waves. She asked me about my own life, not just the jobs or the clients, but the quiet parts. She wanted to know if I'd ever been married. I told her no, that I'd come close once, but it hadn't felt like the kind of yes you build a life on. She nodded like she understood without needing details. She told me she admired that I hadn't settled for something just because it was available. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Do you ever worry that maybe we're all just meant to patch our lives together with the tools we've got, even if nothing ever really fits? I took a long breath before answering. I told her, maybe that's true, but sometimes the right person doesn't come in with a whole new blueprint. They just bring their hands and say, I'll help. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she smiled. Not the polite kind, but the real one that reaches the eyes and stays. That evening, I didn't stay long after that. I could have, maybe even should have. But there was something about the way the night had unfolded that deserved to end on a gentle note. No rushing, no questions, just mutual recognition. As I gathered my things, she walked me to the door. We stood there for a second longer than usual, the cool night air wrapping around us as the porch light buzzed above. She didn't say anything. As I left, neither did I, but we both knew something had shifted. Not drastically, not suddenly, but meaningfully. Like a window opened in a room that had been closed too long. And for the first time in a long time, I drove home feeling like I was carrying something fragile and worth protecting, something that wasn't mine yet. But might be if I stayed patient. The next morning, she texted me a photo of the guest room. Bathed in morning light. The walls glowed, the soft oatmeal color catching the sun in ways I hadn't expected. Under the photo she wrote, feels like the beginning of something, and it did, even if neither of us knew quite what that was yet. I stared at the message for longer than I should have, then sent back, maybe it is. That day, I didn't have any scheduled jobs near her neighborhood, but I found a reason to drive by anyway. The photo she'd sent of the morning. Sunlight in her guest room stayed on my phone longer than most. I kept looking at it that week during slow moments and my other jobs, waiting on supplies, sitting in traffic, taking lunch alone in the back of my truck. It wasn't just the image of the room that held me. It was the sense of peace in it. She'd created a space that looked like freedom, and somehow I'd been part of that. Didn't reach out right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about our pacing felt sacred. We weren't trying to fill the quiet. We were learning to move with it. But by Thursday, I'd texted her to ask if she needed help putting the bookshelves back in. She replied with a quick yes and a smiley face. Simple, but enough. When I arrived, she looked different. Not dramatic, still the same jeans and sweater. Hair tucked back loosely, but her eyes had an energy I hadn't seen in a while. I'm almost done reclaiming this place, she said, gesturing to the hallway. Except for one thing I can't bring myself to deal with. She pointed toward the linen closet. I followed her to the small hallway where the linen closet sat wedged. Between the bathroom and the guest room, she opened the door slowly, revealing a mess of old towels, dusty candles, unused photo frames, and at the bottom, a small box labeled mementos. Her hand hovered above it for a moment. Then she stepped aside and said, I can't open it alone. I didn't ask why. I just nodded and sat on the hallway floor beside her as she slid the box out. The lid creaked like it had aged a century. Inside were the kinds of things people keep when they're still unsure what counts as closure letter from her ex dated 8 years ago. A dried flower from their wedding bouquet, a photograph of the two of them at a New Year's party in their 20s. She stared at the contents for a while, not touching them, as if waiting for the memories to soften on their own. "I've thrown out everything else," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I kept this box like maybe one day I'd find peace in it." I sat quietly, not rushing her. Eventually, she reached in, pulled out the letter, and without reading it, placed it gently into a trash bag she'd brought with her. One by one, the rest followed deliberate, almost ceremonial. When the box was empty, she let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. Later that afternoon, we were in the middle of putting the books back onto her shelf when the doorbell rang. She looked surprised, not expecting anyone, she said, wiping her hands on a towel as she walked to the door. I stayed in the hallway, listening. Her tone changed the moment she opened it, more cautious, almost strained. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but the voice. On the other end was male, low, and familiar enough to make her shoulders tighten. A few minutes later, she closed the door and returned, her face paler than before. "That was him," she said flatly. "My ex." I stood still, not wanting to overreact. He was dropping off some old tax documents. Apparently he found them in storage. Convenient timing. I asked if she was okay. She nodded, but there was a flicker in her eye, something unsettled. He looked around, took note of the paint, the shelves. I could feel it. Like he was silently auditing my recovery. Didn't say anything right away. I let her process it. After a pause, she added, "He didn't ask if I was seeing someone, but he didn't have to. He knew someone else had been here." And I think that bothered him more than he expected. That evening, we didn't finish organizing the shelves. Instead, we sat in the living room, the books still stacked in loose piles on the floor, and just existed in the stillness. I could tell she was turning something over in her mind. I didn't push. Eventually, she looked at me and said, "I thought I was further along than this." But seeing him again, it stirred something. Not longing, not regret, just ... the reminder of how small I used to let myself become. She leaned her head back against the cushion, and it made me want to lock all the doors again. I moved my chair slightly closer, not invading, just anchoring. I told her it was okay to be rattled. That healing doesn't mean the past stops echoing. It just means you've learned not to answer every time it calls. She smiled weakly at that, maybe, she said. But today, it was loud. We stayed there like that until the light dimmed and the room went quiet. When I left that night, I didn't say anything that might press too hard. But before I stepped off the porch, she said, "Thank you for not making me feel like I had to explain myself." I turned and said, "You never do." The next morning, I woke up to a message from her. Just a photo of the trash bag with the word "gone" underneath. No emojis, no long caption, just that. It said more than anything else she could have written. She had let go, not for anyone else's sake, not for closure, but because she was ready, and somehow she'd let me witness it. The photo of the trash bag she'd sent that morning, simple, grainy, taken in her dim hallway, felt like a line in the sand, drawn without spectacle. Gone. That's all she wrote. I stared at it for a long while, surprised by how proud I felt, even though I hadn't done anything but sit beside her. It reminded me that sometimes presence is its own form of strength, that standing beside someone quietly while they deal with their past is more powerful than anything you can say. I didn't message back right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted her to feel the full weight of that moment without my words trying to dilute it. A few hours later, I asked if she wanted lunch. She said yes. I picked up her favorite Thai food, and when I arrived, she had already cleared the guest room floor to create a picnic, set up pillows, a blanket, and a playlist humming low in the background. We ate on the floor, between newly painted walls and stacks of books, like two people carving out a pocket of joy in a house that had once carried too much silence. She was lighter that day, not in a performative way, but in a grounded, steady way. She moved with ease, joked more freely, touched my arm without hesitation when laughing. It wasn't flirtatious, it was real, warmth without expectation. I noticed little things I hadn't before, how she always refilled my glass before her own, how she looked out the window for a second before answering tough questions, how she always had a candle lit even in the daytime. After lunch, she pulled out an old notebook, soft at the corners, and said she'd started writing again. Nothing fancy, just thoughts, reflections, sometimes just lists of things she wanted to feel. Today I wrote, stillness, security, something. Real? She laughed after reading it. That last one feels like cheating. I don't even know what it means. I told her maybe that's the point, that real things aren't clean or clear, they're just the ones that don't ask you to shrink to fit inside them. She didn't reply right away. I could tell she tucked the thought away like she would later press it into a page. Later that afternoon, we took a walk around her neighborhood. It was something we'd never done before, not like this. It'd always come and gone through the front gate, tools in hand, focused on tasks. But now, walking side by side on uneven sidewalks beneath overgrown trees, it felt different, familiar. We talked about things we hadn't before, where we grew up, what our childhood homes were like, the odd jobs we'd taken to get through, school. I told her about a summer I'd spent repairing fences for a retired couple who treated me like a grandson, feeding me lemon pie and making me promise to fix every hinge, even the ones that didn't need fixing. She told me about her first apartment after her separation, a fourth-floor walk-up with thin walls, where she learned how to patch holes in drywall by watching YouTube videos at 2 a.m. That place taught me how to be self-sufficient. Said, but it also made me tired in a way I didn't understand until years later. She stopped walking and turned to me. You know what I realized this week? I shook my head. I've spent so long trying to prove I could do everything alone that I forgot how nice it is to just let someone help. Not because I can't, but because I don't have to anymore. We rounded the corner near her street and passed a neighbor pruning their roses. The woman gave us a curious glance, but said nothing. I didn't mind, and neither did she. We reached her front porch just as the light was starting to shift, that golden late afternoon hue making everything feel cinematic. We stood there for a moment, not saying much. I could tell she didn't want the moment to end, and neither did I. She finally looked at me and asked if I'd ever done this kind of work for someone and stayed. I smiled and told her the truth, no. Most jobs ended with a handshake and an invoice. But this wasn't a job anymore. Hadn't been for a while. I stepped a little closer and said, I stayed because you made it easy too. She didn't look away. Not once did you make me feel like I owed you anything for that, she replied. There was a kind of reverence in that moment, like we were both finally admitting to ourselves what had been unfolding between us. It wasn't about fixing things anymore. It was about being part of something that didn't need fixing to be valuable. Before I left that evening, she reached into the drawer by her door and pulled out the last item from the mementos. Boxed the photograph of her and her ex at that New Year's party. She didn't rip it or burn it. She simply placed it back into the drawer, face down. Not everything has to be thrown away, she said softly. Some things just need to be put in their proper place. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about not letting it direct the future. She walked me to my truck, and as I climbed in, she said, thanks for lunch and the walk, and for not treating this like something temporary. I looked at her one last time and said, this never felt temporary to me. For once, she didn't argue. The next time I arrived at her house, something felt off before I even stepped inside. The lights were on, but the curtains were drawn tight, as if trying to shut the world out. Her front door opened before I had a chance to knock, and she greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sadness, exactly. It was more like a quiet withdrawal, the kind that happens when someone is battling something they can't quite name out loud. I asked if she was all right, and she waved it off, saying she hadn't slept well. She told me the sink in the laundry room was dripping again, and asked if I could take a look. I followed her inside, tools in hand, but I could feel her energy. like a thin layer of fog between us. The home that had recently felt warm and filled with life now felt like it was holding its breath. While I worked under the counter, tightening an old valve that never seemed to hold properly, I heard her pacing. Softly behind me, no music this time, no candle burning in the hallway, just the occasional creak of the floorboards and the subtle hum of her overthinking.
Oh.
When I finished, I stood up and offered her a soft smile. She thanked me and motioned for us to sit, but even then, her hands were restless, picking at a loose thread on the edge of the cushion. After a few moments, she finally spoke. "My daughter called last night," she said, her voice measured. I hadn't known she had a daughter. I kept my expression neutral, listening. "She's in college, out of state. Out of state. We haven't talked much lately, not because of anything dramatic, just ... space." She paused. "She's coming to visit next week." I didn't realize how nervous that would make me. I could hear the edge in her voice, the uncertainty. She was someone who had grown into herself by learning how to stand alone. The idea of someone from her past, someone who knew her before the rebuilding returning, even temporarily, had clearly shaken something loose. She admitted she hadn't told her daughter about me, not out of shame, but because she didn't know what to call this what we were. She wasn't asking for a definition. She wasn't trying to pin me down. But she was afraid, I realized, of seeming foolish. Of her daughter walking into a home that finally felt hers again and questioning the presence of a man who had quietly slipped into it. "Not used to letting people in," she said. "And now that I have, I'm scared of having to justify it." I didn't take offense. I knew exactly what she meant. She wasn't doubting me. She was doubting how the world would perceive her openness, I reassured her. In the only way that felt honest, I told her she didn't owe anyone an explanation. That if this sus was still unfolding, then it had the right to remain a story in progress. "If your daughter's coming home to see you happy, then that's all she needs to see," I said. Her shoulders eased just a little, but the tension didn't leave completely. Some worries linger, even when spoken aloud. As the visit drew closer, I stepped back, not out of fear, but to give her the space I knew she needed. She texted occasionally short updates about grocery lists, new throw pillows, old memories resurfacing as she cleaned. There was a picture of a dusty ceramic mug her daughter had made in grade school, still tucked in the back of the cupboard. "I forgot this even existed," she wrote. "Funny how things survive when nothing else does." I told her to keep it. Some things, even chipped, carry more meaning than anything new. She didn't invite me over that week, and I didn't push. Instead, I filled the time with quieter tasks, organizing my tools, fixing up my truck, catching up on overdue jobs. But even with my hands busy, my thoughts circled back to her porch. Her voice, the half-laughs we used to share on slow afternoons. It was strange how quickly I'd gotten used to being part of someone's daily rhythm, and how empty it felt. To slip out of it, even briefly. When she finally messaged me after the visit, it was a single line. "She left this morning." I waited, not sure if she wanted to talk or sit with her thoughts. A few hours later, she called. Not texted, called. Her voice sounded tired, but not weighed down. She said the visit had been better than expected. Her daughter had asked questions. Of course, who painted this room with you? Why is the fence fixed? Who's he in the notebook you left on the couch? And none of the questions came with judgment, only curiosity. And when she finally explained who I was, or at least what she could explain, her daughter had smiled and said, "You seem lighter, Mom, like yourself again, but newer." That sentence had stayed with her, like myself again, but newer. It made her cry, she admitted, and not out of sadness, but because she hadn't realized how far she'd come until someone else held up the mirror. Her daughter's words lingered in my head longer than I expected. "You seem lighter, Mom, like yourself again, but newer." There was something in that phrasing that struck me deeper than I was ready for. It made me think about how people grow when no one's looking. How healing doesn't always happen in loud, triumphant bursts, but in quiet, patient repetition. And I suppose that's what I had started to feel too. It was more than just a job, more than just stepping into a home that needed repairs. This woman, this house, had slowly begun stitching itself into the rhythm of my life. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of that. Still, after hearing about the visit with her daughter, I realized something else. She had opened her past to me in pieces, shown me what she had been through, what she had rebuilt from, and yet I hadn't given her much of myself. I'd kept my story tidy, with clean edges, not out of deceit, but habit. A lifetime of learning when to show up and when to stay hidden. But now it felt unfair to ask for her vulnerability if I wasn't willing to offer mine. A few days later, I asked if she wanted to join me on a supply run to a salvage yard on the edge of town. I needed a few parts for another project, and I figured the drive might be a good excuse to talk. She said yes. When I picked her up, she wore a faded flannel over a simple tank top, hair tied back, coffee in hand. We didn't talk much during the first stretch of the drive. We let the open road do most of the speaking. The salvage yard was nearly empty. When we arrived, sun slanting through rows of rusted metal and broken windows, we walked slowly through the aisles, inspecting odd bolts and cracked sinks, but I could tell she sensed something deeper brewing in me. Finally, while we stood near an old workbench with a missing drawer, I told her about the woman I almost married. Her name was Lana. We were too young to know the difference between comfort and connection. She was kind, thoughtful, and for a long time I convinced myself that was enough. But over the years, I became someone I didn't recognize. Distant. Always on the move. Fixing everything I could get my hands on because I didn't know how to fix the growing silence between us. When we finally split, there wasn't a big fight or dramatic goodbye. Just a realization that we'd both quietly let go long before we said the words out loud. I told her about the years that followed, how I threw myself into work, into routine, into staying busy. How I told myself I liked being alone because at least I couldn't disappoint anyone that way. The truth is, I said, my voice a little hoarse, for a long time I thought I was only good at temporary things. Short fixes, quick jobs. I never trusted myself to stay. She didn't say anything right away. She just walked over and stood next to me, her hand brushing mine. And in that simple gesture, I felt more seen than I had in years. She didn't ask for more. She didn't press. She just gave me space to be real without needing to be perfect. On the ride back, we didn't say much. But it wasn't silence, it was something fuller. Like we'd stepped into a deeper current of understanding. Two people who had both tried to survive by being self-sufficient, now slowly learning that connection isn't a weakness. It's a choice. One that takes just as much strength. That week, something shifted between us, not dramatically, but quietly. Like the way summer turns into early fall without anyone noticing the first cool breeze. We didn't see each other every day, but when we did, the time felt intentional. She started leaving small things for me on the porch: a thermos of coffee, a folded note with a joke, a spare key hidden in the planter, just in case I came by. Early, I started leaving tools behind on purpose, giving myself an excuse to return. We were still us, no confessions. No labels, but the way we moved around each other was softer, more honest. She began opening up even more about the nights she still had trouble sleeping. About how sometimes she talked out loud to herself just to fill the silence. About how she still flinched a little when the phone rang after 10 p.m. because, for years, that's when the worst calls came. I listened without fixing, and she spoke without apologizing. That's the kind of growth that doesn't need fanfare. It just needs to be witnessed. And maybe that's what this whole thing had become: a quiet witnessing. A slow unraveling of old fears, new trust forming in the gentle way we folded into each other's routines. I noticed how she started setting 2 mugs out in the morning, even when I hadn't said I was coming. I noticed how I stopped checking the time when I was with her. How I started picturing her in parts of my day where she hadn't been before: grocery store aisles. Early drives to job sites, the quiet moment before I fell asleep. And I think she noticed it too, even if neither of us said anything out loud. Some things don't need to be named to be real. Some things are truest in the way they live quietly inside your days. And that's what we were becoming. Not a romance with grand declarations, but a steadiness that felt like safety. The shift came. Not with a bang, but with the kind of silence that doesn't announce itself until it's been sitting in the room too long. A few days had passed since our trip to the salvage yard, and though our conversations had grown warmer, the frequency of them slowed. At first, I chalked it up to life getting in the way. Schedules change, days blur. But I couldn't help noticing the absence not just in the lack of texts or calls, but in the pauses that used to feel intentional and now felt uncertain. She hadn't asked me to come by that week, and I hadn't pushed. I'd told myself to respect her rhythm, to give her the space she might need. Still, I missed the way her presence had quietly softened the edges of my days. I thought about her daughter's visit, how it might have stirred something deeper. Not fear exactly, but maybe the realization of how real this was. Becoming that kind of vulnerability has a weight. And sometimes, even when we want something, the reality of it showing up can be overwhelming. When she finally did reach out, it was late in the evening. Short message. I'm okay. Just needed to be still for a bit. I understood her, at least I tried to. I told her I was here whenever she felt like talking. She replied with a heart. And that was it for the night. The next day, I drove past her street by coincidence. One of my jobs had gotten rescheduled and I was heading home the long way. I wasn't trying to check in on her, but I found myself slowing down as I passed her house. The lights were on in the living room, but the porch was dark, unlit. A small signal that things were quieter inside. I didn't stop. I didn't knock. I just kept going. The feeling stuck with me something was shifting. I wasn't sure if it was mine to fix. That weekend, I threw myself into work. I took on a last-minute fence repair 2 towns over, spent extra time organizing my supplies, even deep-cleaned my truck. It was my old habit resurfacing busyness as a distraction. But no matter how much I tried to redirect my focus, I kept circling back to her, to the long walks, the shared stories, the silence that had once felt safe. I wondered if maybe I'd misunderstood something. If maybe I'd read too much into her quietness, projected my own hope into spaces where she had simply needed solitude. I didn't want to be someone who demanded clarity before it was ready to be given. And yet a small voice inside me kept asking, was she pulling back, or was this just the ebb of something still building? One morning I stood in my kitchen, holding my phone for a full 10 minutes before texting her. Wrote and rewrote the message. 3 times, finally settling on, I miss hearing from you. No pressure, just wanted you to know. She didn't reply that day. Or the next. It wasn't until Monday evening that my phone lit up. Her name on the screen felt like a pulse returning. Can you come by tomorrow? She wrote. There's something I need to tell you. The message was short, but it sent my thoughts spiraling. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but there was a nervousness in the wording I couldn't ignore. The next morning I arrived with a knot in my stomach I hadn't felt since I was a teenager asking someone to prom. When she opened the door, she looked tired but not distressed. More like someone who had spent a week gathering the courage. To name something heavy, we didn't linger in the hallway. She led me straight to the kitchen where the table was already set with 2 mugs, steam curling from the tops. She sat before I did, her hands folded neatly on the surface, as if she were bracing herself. I've been thinking a lot, she started, and I could already feel the shift coming. About what this is, about what I can offer, about what I'm still afraid of. She wasn't ending things. Not exactly. But she was drawing a line one I hadn't seen coming. She told me that while she cared deeply for me, something inside her still flinched at the idea of a future, of anything. That felt like permanence. It's not you, she said, and I believed her. It's me, still figuring out what it means to be whole on my own. Oh. She wasn't asking me to leave, but she was asking me to understand that she couldn't give more than what she had. That maybe what we were, what we had built, wasn't ready to become something more defined. I sat there, listening, feeling both proud of her and painfully stung. It's a strange thing. To care for someone and realize that care has to include giving them space to not choose you, at least not yet. I told her I understood, that I respected her honesty more than she knew. And as I said it, I meant every word, even while a small ache bloomed in my chest. When I left her house that day, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel rejected. I did feel something shift deep inside me, something that reminded me of a truth I hadn't faced in years. That sometimes loving someone means standing still. When every part of you wants to run forward. The following days, settled into a quiet routine. Not unlike the ones I used to live before I met her, but now they felt heavier, like I was carrying silence in my back pocket. I returned to my usual jobs, patching drywall for an elderly couple downtown, placing a cracked bathroom mirror in a duplex on the edge of the city, fixing the squeaky hinge of a retired teacher who offered me baked goods in place of payment. The tasks were the same, the days full enough, but I was no longer moving with the same calm focus. Each new face reminded me of hers in some quiet way. The mirror reflected how I hadn't really smiled in days. The teacher's stories reminded me of our walks. The way she could twist a memory into something so vivid, I'd feel like I'd lived it with her. It was odd how someone could fill a room just by not being in it. Her absence didn't echo it, just pressed into everything I touched. Not enough to hurt, just enough to notice. And maybe that was the worst part. It wasn't heartbreak. It was missing, steady, shapeless, persistent. I didn't text her. I told myself she needed space. And I intended to respect it, even if every instinct in me itched to ask how she was. If she'd eaten, if her window still stuck when it rained. I checked the weather more than usual, worried it would flood again and she'd need me. But there were no messages, no urgent calls, no late-night photos of chipped mugs or old receipts she found tucked in cookbooks. The world didn't stop. Turning it just spun quieter. I tried to distract myself with side projects. I dug through storage to finally repair my father's old toolbox, oiling the hinges and replacing a broken latch. The work steadied me, but the thoughts kept coming. What if I had rushed things? What if I had misunderstood the rhythm of her healing? Maybe she needed someone to sit still beside her, not someone already halfway to building a life. Maybe I had fallen too fast into the warmth she offered, mistaking the firelight for permanence when it was just meant to keep us warm for a while. One afternoon, I found myself parked near the lake on the edge of town, the one I used to visit as a kid. It was quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind or a bird skimming the surface. I sat on the hood of my truck with a thermos of coffee and watched the water ripple. I thought about how some things, like lakes and people, hold more beneath the surface than they ever let show. She had been that way too, gentle on the outside, with storms that she rarely let anyone see. And I had been the man who tried to sail across it without asking how deep it went. The thought didn't come with regret, just understanding. We'd both come into each other's lives carrying years we hadn't unpacked. She had survived a kind of loneliness that doesn't show up in photos or journals. I had masked mine with motion projects, repairs, a calendar filled with work to avoid stillness. But in each other, we'd found something that neither of us expected, the safety of being seen without needing to explain. And now, with distance between us, I realized that the seeing hadn't stopped. It was just paused, caught mid-dash breath. By the end of that week, I had almost convinced myself that maybe we were done. Not in a dramatic, angry kind of way, but in the slow fade that so many stories follow. Maybe she would call again in a few weeks. Maybe not. Maybe I'd drive past her street in a month and see someone else fixing the gate. Or maybe the house would just remain still, tucked into its own quiet healing. Ouch. But life has a strange way of nudging you at the exact moment you're ready to give up. That Saturday morning, as I was gathering supplies for a job across town, I received a message. It wasn't long, just a single line. The laundry faucet is leaking again. It was the simplest excuse, but it felt like a hand reaching. Through the fog, I stared at it for a long moment, unsure if I should read more into it. But I knew her well enough to understand that she never said more than she meant. If she'd written that she wanted me there not just as a handyman, but as a familiar presence, I replied with a thumbs up and told her I'd be by in an hour. As I pulled into her driveway, I felt the nerves rising again, but they were different this time. Softer, quieter. She met me at the door, wearing a loose sweater and jeans, her hair tucked behind her ears like always. The porch smelled like jasmine and coffee. She stepped aside without saying much, letting me in with a slight smile. I walked straight to the laundry room and knelt down, pretending to focus on the faucet, but really just needing a moment to collect myself. She sat nearby, sipping from a mug and watching quietly. "It started leaking 2 days ago," she said eventually.
Well, that.
I didn't message until now. I nodded. It's okay. Sometimes things take a minute. We didn't talk about the distance. We didn't talk about what had changed. Something in the room had shifted again, like a knot being untied. Not all the way. Enough to let a little air in. And in that quiet space, beneath the drip of an old pipe and the hum of a tired washing machine, we sat with each other again. No promises, no titles, just presence. And somehow, that felt like the most honest beginning yet. The laundry room repair didn't take long, but I stretched it out anyway. I ran my hands along the length of the pipe twice, double-checked the washer seal, resecured a clamp that didn't need adjusting, then cleaned up slowly, lingering on the feel of the old ceramic tile beneath my knees. She stood behind me, leaning, lightly against the wall, arms crossed but relaxed. There was a calm between us that hadn't existed a few weeks ago. No tension, no urgency, just a quiet understanding. When I finally closed my toolbox, she asked if I had time for coffee. The question was casual, but her voice was careful, like she was testing to see if I'd still say yes. I did. And she smiled like that mattered more than she'd let on. The kitchen, she poured 2 mugs without asking how I liked mine. She remembered black, no sugar. We stood by the window, sipping slowly, both watching the backyard. A crooked fence post leaned to one side like it had lost a fight with the wind. The rain's been pooling again, she said after a while, eyes scanning the edge of her garden bed. It's ruining the roots. Her tone was soft, but there was a tiredness underneath it. I looked where she pointed. The drainage was poor. The soil near the fence was waterlogged, and the few plants that had survived the summer heat were now drowning. I can help fix it, I said, not as a favor, but like a suggestion. She nodded after a pause. Let's do it together. Next morning, I pulled into her driveway with a tarp, gravel, trenching tools, and an extra pair of gloves. She was already outside when I arrived, wearing an old sweatshirt with tiny paint stains near the cuffs, and her hair pulled up in a loose knot. The garden hose lay coiled by the porch, and a small shovel was stuck upright in the soft ground, like a flag marking our starting point. I greeted her with a grin. She responded with a look that said she wasn't sure if we were rebuilding her yard or something far less visible. We started with the trench. It was slow work, especially with the early fall chill settling in the air and the soil damp from yesterday's storm. She dug with determination, occasionally stopping to wipe her brow or catch her breath. We worked. Side by side, boots sinking into the soft ground, barely speaking for the first hour. It wasn't uncomfortable. There was a rhythm to it, dig, lift, drop like the earth had set the tempo, and we were following. Eventually the silence gave way to conversation, light at first. She talked about how her daughter used to plant wildflowers along that same edge. I shared how my dad taught me how to mix gravel and clay to keep a trench from caving in. Then the stories deepened. She told me about her father's garden, long gone now, and how he'd whisper to his tomato plants like they were old friends. He used to call me Little Oak, she said, her voice catching for just a moment. Said I never bent, even in storms. By midday, our hands were muddy and our clothes streaked with dirt. We took a break on the porch steps, sipping water from tin cups she'd brought out. Her dog, usually nowhere to be found when I was around, sat at her feet, tail thumping lazily. He's finally warming up to you, she said, nodding too. The shepherd mix, I chuckled. Took less time than you did. She rolled her eyes, but her smile lingered. We were back in the yard within minutes, laying pipe and securing the lining that would keep the trench stable. Every now and then, our hands brushed as we passed tools or reached for the same root. Once, she slipped slightly on a wet patch of grass and instinctively grabbed my arm. I steadied her, and she didn't pull away immediately. We stood there for a moment longer than necessary, just enough for it to mean something. That small moment, muddy boots, her fingers wrapped gently around my sleeve, her eyes meeting mine with something like surprise and certainty, code louder than anything we'd said all day. Didn't talk about it then, but we didn't. Need to? We just returned to work, but with a new kind of ease between us, like something had clicked softly into place. Later that afternoon, as we packed up our tools, I noticed her watching the now level garden bed. The water had already begun to drain slowly through the gravel, the soil no longer heavy and drowned. "It's strange," she said after a while. "This feels more satisfying than anything I've done in weeks." I knew she wasn't just talking about the yard. I felt it too. There was something grounding about building something real, fixing something together with our hands. She looked up at me. "It's been a long time since I did something like this." With someone, she hesitated, and liked it. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. I didn't want to break the moment with the wrong words. Instead, I offered a simple, "Me too." Before I left, she walked me to the truck, something she hadn't done since before the pause. "There's still the fence," she said, looking toward the slanted post. "It leans." I said, "Maybe next week. Only if you let me hammer this time." She grinned. I lifted my toolbox into the truck bed and replied, "Deal." That night I couldn't sleep. Not from worry, but from the weight of everything unsaid that still felt clear. We were finding our way back to each other. Not with grand gestures or speeches, but with each trench dug, each plant rescued, each shared glance over a patch of turned soil. I thought about the way she looked at me while brushing the dirt off her gloves. The way our silences had turned into comfort rather than tension. I wasn't in love, not yet, but I was standing on the edge of something good, something worth building. I knew she was still cautious. I could feel the part of her that held back, that wanted to move slowly and protect what she was rebuilding. Inside. But I also knew she was letting me in, inch by inch. She didn't need me to fix her house anymore. She wanted me to be there when she decided to fix it herself. Somehow, that meant more. Drifted off thinking about the fence we hadn't repaired yet, and how sometimes leaning wasn't the same as breaking. Sometimes things just needed time and the right hands to steady them. The morning after we finished the trench, I half expected a text canceling the next project, but instead, she sent a photo, just her gloved hand holding up a loose fence post. Bolt with the caption, "Still leaning." I smiled at the message, not because of the humor, but because of what it meant. She wasn't backing away. She wanted this next chapter, whether it was about fences or something neither of us could quite name yet. I spent the morning picking up new brackets, heavier-duty nails, and a weather-resistant wood sealant. I brought my good drill just like I promised, along with 2 folding chairs and a cheap bottle of lemonade I thought she might like. When I pulled into her driveway, the sun was already high, and her front gate was wide open. She stood in the yard, wearing sunglasses and holding a clipboard, trying to look serious, but clearly suppressing a grin. "You ready?" she asked. "Always," I said. It was different that day, not just the work, but the energy. It felt like we were on the edge of something unnamed but deeply understood, like the fence wasn't the only thing we were about. To straighten, we started at the far end where the panels sagged the most. She held them steady while I measured and drilled. Every so often, she'd mutter something about how her ex always talked about fixing things but never lifted a finger. I didn't press for more, but I listened. She wasn't bitter, it was. More like she was sorting through old memories aloud, placing them where they belonged so she could leave them there. "It's not even about the fence," she said at one point, dusting her palms against her jeans. "It's about not having to do everything alone anymore." That struck me harder than I expected. I didn't reply right away, just passed her a bracket and nodded. We worked for hours, and by the time the sun began to dip, we had almost finished. The entire stretch. She brought out 2 beers this time instead of lemonade, cracking one open and handing it to me wordlessly. We sat on the porch steps again, sweat damp and quiet, watching the warm orange light fall across the boards we had. Straightened. They stood taller now, lined in a clean row like they had purpose again. She took a long sip of her drink and then looked over at me. "You didn't just fix that drain or dig a trench," she said, her voice soft. "You showed up, and you stayed." I didn't know what to say. I just held her gaze, and she didn't look away. The air between us felt still, suspended, as the evening turned to night. She lit a few citronella candles and brought out a blanket for the porch. We sat side by side, the air cooling around us, fireflies blinking across the yard like little sparks of memory. She pulled her knees up, resting, her chin on them, and for a long time, we just watched the dark fill in the spaces the sun left behind. "I used to be afraid of silence," she said after a while. "Thought it meant something was wrong. But with you, it's different. It's easier." "Hey?" I leaned back against the wooden siding and let that sit for a second. I felt it too. The kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. Eventually she turned and asked if I wanted to see something. I followed her inside, through the kitchen and into a small hallway I hadn't noticed before. At the end was a door, slightly ajar, revealing a room full of boxers, old frames, stacks of letters tied with twine. She flicked on a lamp. "I've been meaning to go through this stuff," she said. "It's everything I packed up when he left. I just... never opened it." Her voice wasn't sad. It was matter of fact, like someone naming a task on a list they'd been avoiding for too long. "You don't have to," I said. "I know," she replied, "but I think I want to. Not tonight. Just... soon." Back on the porch, the mood had shifted, not heavier, just more real. She sat closer now, her shoulder brushing mine, her bare foot tapping lightly against my boot. I could feel the weight of the day in my bones, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind you get after putting things right. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was scared the first day you came, not because of you, but because I didn't know how to let someone help without feeling weak." I looked at her, the candlelight catching the curve of her cheek, the tired but content glint in her eyes. "But you didn't try to fix me," she continued. "You just fixed the things I let you." I didn't know what to say, but I reached out then, slowly giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Our fingers brushed, then intertwined. No big declaration, just the quiet joining of two people who had found each other through slow work and shared effort. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped, watching the moon rise behind the freshly mended fence. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just a chapter. It was the start of something neither of us had words for yet, but both of us finally believed could last. That night, when I finally left, she walked me to the gate. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hug. But the way she looked at me before I got into the truck, that steady, unflinching gaze said more than any words could have. She wasn't asking me to promise anything. She wasn't expecting me to change her world. She just wanted to know that when she opened her door again, I'd still be there. And I knew without a doubt that I would be. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need to. Her voice echoed gently in my head. The way she'd said you showed up, and you stayed. That was all it had taken. Not flowers, not speeches. Just being there when it mattered. Just holding steady while she rebuilt. I pulled into my driveway, under a sky full of stars, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I felt like I was building something, not just with wood and tools, but with presence, with patience, and maybe, just maybe, with love. The next day was quiet. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because we were both processing something we didn't quite have words for yet. I didn't text her that morning. I waited, let the silence breathe. Trusted that she'd reach out when she was ready. And she did me, afternoon, a short message that simply said, "Are you free later?" I replied, "Always." When I pulled up to the house, it looked different, though nothing physical had changed. Maybe it was just the way the late sun hit the porch, or how the windows glowed soft gold from the inside. Like something warm had finally settled in after a long winter. She met me at the door wearing jeans, a faded flannel, and no makeup, her hair tied in a loose braid. She didn't say much, just nodded toward the living room and then disappeared down the hallway. I followed the sound of her footsteps to that room she had shown me before, the one filled with boxes from her past. She was kneeling in front of one now, a pair of scissors in her hand, and a small stack of photo albums beside her. "Started," she said. "Thought maybe you'd sit with me for a while." I did. I sat next to her on the carpet, and for the next hour, we sifted through pieces of her life. There were wedding photos, faded and curled at the edges. Pictures of vacations, of birthday cakes, of people smiling like they believed those moments would last forever. She didn't cry, not even when she picked up a framed photo of herself holding a baby, looking tired but happy. Daughters. First birthday, she said, her voice steady. Remember baking the cake myself. He promised he'd be home early to help. It didn't show until after she was asleep. She placed the frame face down and moved on. Each box was a time capsule, and each object inside was a thread leading back to a version of herself she hadn't touched in years. There were letters to some unopened, some stained at the corners. A few times, she stopped and held something. In her hands a little longer than the rest, her silence filling the room like music. I didn't interrupt. I was just there, listening without pressing, offering presence instead of solutions. She said at one point, I didn't expect to feel all of this, and I replied softly, it's okay, you're allowed to. As the light shifted from afternoon to dusk, we found ourselves surrounded by open boxes, memories scattered like puzzle pieces waiting to be reassembled. She leaned back against the couch, her eyes glassy but clear, and said, I think I needed to see all of this again, not to remember him, but to remember me. Later that evening, we moved to the kitchen, not to cook, just to be in a different room. I offered to make grilled cheese, the only thing I'm decent at tanned. She accepted. With a smile that said she needed something simple and warm, we stood side by side, and I noticed how her hand lingered a little longer when she passed me the butter. She was quiet, not withdrawn, just reflective. After we ate, we returned to the porch. It had become our place, neutral, grounding, a place where words didn't need to be fancy to matter. She pulled the blanket up over her legs and watched the stars begin to poke through. The sky like scattered holes in black velvet. He wasn't cruel, she said suddenly. Not the kind you see in movies. But he chipped away at me slowly. Every promise broken, every job undone. Every moment he said he'd show up and didn't. That's the kind of cruelty people don't talk about. The kind that leaves no scars but hollows you out. I listened, heart heavy, but steady. I wasn't here to fix that pain. I was just here to witness it. She looked at me then, her eyes fierce with something almost like challenge. Do you really want to be part of this? Because this isn't some sweet fixer-upper. This is years of silence, of doing everything alone. I'm not sure I know how to share the load anymore. I reached for her hand, not because I had the perfect words, because I wanted her to feel the weight of mine, solid and real. She didn't pull away. A few minutes passed before she spoke again. You've been here every day for weeks. Not just for the house, for me. But I don't know how to trust that yet. I want to. But trust isn't something I hand out easily anymore. I squeezed her hand gently, then said, I don't need you to trust me today. I just need you to. No, I'll be here tomorrow, she exhaled, like a balloon deflating quietly. You say that like it's easy? It's not, I replied. But you're worth showing up for. She didn't answer right away, just leaned her head against my shoulder and closed her eyes. The crickets filled the silence. The candlelight danced across the wood railing. We stayed like that until the air grew cold and our arms were stiff. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the gate again. But this time, before I could reach for the latch, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. Not tentative, not polite. No, just full, firm, certain. I held her back, steady as I could, and we stayed like that until the night wrapped around us completely. No promises, no plans. It's just the simple, wordless answer to every fear she'd whispered. Driving home, I thought about all the things people leave behind in boxes, photos, letters, pieces of their younger selves they weren't ready to face. But what struck me most was how bravely she had opened them. One by one, letting the past breathe without letting it control her. That took more courage than anything I'd done with a wrench or drill. And it made me realize something important. Love isn't about stepping in and doing everything right. It's about being there when someone decides to rebuild and letting them lead the way. She wasn't asking me to carry her past. She was asking me to stand beside her while she unpacked it. And that kind of love? That's the kind that lasts. I pulled into my driveway with a heart that felt a little heavier, but also more certain than it had in years. She didn't need a hero. She just needed someone who wouldn't disappear when the boxers came down off the shelf. The morning after, she'd hug me at the gate. Something about the world felt gentler. I woke before the sun, the sky still painted in soft gradients of blue-gray, and made coffee without rushing. I stood by my window longer than usual, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my palms. Thinking about her head resting on my shoulder the night before, and the way she had held me without hesitation, like her walls had softened just enough to allow the warmth in. There wasn't a text from her waiting on my phone, and I didn't mind. I didn't need daily reassurance anymore. What we had built over these weeks, one trench, one conversation, one quiet porch moment at a time, had started to settle into something that could carry its own weight. So I filled the back of my truck with a few supplies I hadn't planned on using. Some extra hinges, a new outdoor light fixture, a few cans of weatherproof paint, and drove toward her house without an agenda. I wasn't going to knock on her door with a task. I was just going to be there in case she needed someone to stand beside her again. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already outside in the backyard. Not working, just sitting on the old wooden bench beneath the dogwood tree, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a steaming cup of something in her hands. I walked around slowly so I wouldn't startle her, and when she looked up and saw me, there was no surprise in her eyes. It's just quiet acceptance, like some part of her knew I'd come even before she asked. I sat beside her without a word. The air between us was cool, the kind of crisp that hints at autumn even when the calendar still insists it's summer. The grass was still damp with dew, and the dog who had finally stopped barking at me a week ago curled at her feet. For a while we just sat there, our shoulders brushing slightly, our breaths fogging the air in faint matching clouds. Then she spoke, and her voice was soft but steady. I think I've been grieving a version of my life that never happened. She was staring out at the fence we'd fixed together. I kept waiting for it to get better, for him to wake up one day and care enough to stay late to fix the gutter, or ask how my day went without checking his phone, halfway through my answer. But that version of him didn't exist. I waited so long, I forgot that I was allowed to stop waiting. I listened, heart thudding in quiet sympathy, not just for her, but for all the invisible weight she'd been carrying. "Oh, Maud, telling you this for pity," she said. "I think I just need someone to know what happened. That it was real, even if it was broken." I nodded, grounding myself in the honesty of the moment. Then I did something I hadn't done before, I shared. A piece of myself, something I'd locked up under layers of humor and hammer-swinging distraction. My mom used to say that fixing things was my way of keeping people from seeing the cracks in me, I began. When she died, I didn't talk to anyone for 3 months. I just repaired everything around me. The fence, the water heater, my truck starter. I rebuilt a deck I didn't even need. I thought if I kept everything else standing, I wouldn't fall apart. Her eyes met mine then, wide with something that felt like recognition, like 2 puzzle pieces finally pressed together, but I still did, I added. Eventually I cracked, just quieter than most people noticed. She reached for my hand this time, not out of sympathy, but something deeper. I need to hold the honesty between us, like something sacred. The dog shifted beside her, resting its head on her shoe like it, too, was acknowledging something had changed. We stayed on that bench long enough for the shadows to shift and the sun to warm the top of the trees. Eventually we both stood, neither of us mentioning the boxes still in the house or the plans that had once been made and never followed through. Instead, she asked if I wanted to help her paint the side gate. It was an old metal one, rusting. Near the hinges and flaking where the old coat had surrendered to weather and time. "It's nothing fancy," she said, already pulling out the cans I'd left near the porch weeks ago. "But it might be nice to give it a fresh start." And so we did. With brushes in hand, we worked in comfortable silence again, the kind you don't have to fill. The new paint was a soft green, the kind that almost matched the leaves around the edges of the fence. And as we covered the rust, I thought about how symbolic it felt to be painting over something old, not to erase it, but to honor that it had lasted long enough to be worth saving. Her laugh surprised me as a fleck of paint landed on her cheek, and I reached out instinctively to wipe it away. She didn't flinch. In fact, She leaned slightly into my hand, and the softness of that gesture made my chest tighten in a way that was both comforting and electric. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It hadn't been for a while. We were healing, side by side, one task at a time. By the time we finished, the sun had dipped low again, and our hands were speckled with green and gray. She looked at the gate, then at me, then back at the gate like she was measuring the difference between what had been and what was now. "It's good," she said. "Better than it's looked in years." I knew she wasn't just talking about the gate. I washed my hands in the garden hose while she tidied up. Then we sat on the porch one more time. This time, she brought out 2 mugs of something warm, and neither of us said a word for a long while. Just the occasional glance, the kind that didn't need translation. Before I left, she walked me to the truck again, her arm brushing mine, her pace slow and unhurried. At the door, she paused. "You'll come by tomorrow." It wasn't a question. It was a statement made from hope. I smiled. "Yeah, I will." She reached up and tapped my shoulder once before stepping back inside, and I stood there a moment longer. Just long enough to feel the warmth of the porch light spill over me like an invitation to return not just to the house, but to whatever we were becoming. The next morning came with a sky heavy with clouds and the kind of gray light that makes everything feel slightly uncertain. I sat in my truck for longer than usual before starting the engine, unsure of whether the tension I felt was from the weather or something deeper. Maybe it was the way her voice lingered in my memory the night before, when she'd asked so quietly, "You'll come by tomorrow." Maybe it was the fear that this comfort we'd built might shift the moment we both had to name it. I drove over. Her car was in the driveway, but the house looked still. Not empty, but paused. I knocked once, then twice. No answer. I waited another minute before circling around the side, where I found her crouched near the garden beds. Her gloved hands buried deep in the soil, pulling weeds with a kind of urgency that looked more emotional than practical. I didn't say anything, just stood there for a few seconds until she noticed me. When she did, she didn't smile. She just nodded, then sat back on her heels, brushing dirt off her pants slowly as if grounding herself. "Didn't hear you?" she said simply, and I could hear the strain under her voice. It wasn't distance. It was fear dressed up as detachment. I joined her without asking, kneeling beside her in the damp mulch. We worked in silence, and though our bodies were close, something had shifted. Her movements were quicker, more focused, like she was trying to keep busy so the quiet between us wouldn't spill over into meaning. After half an hour of pruning and pulling, she finally spoke. "My daughter's coming by this weekend," she said. "She wants to meet you." The words hit harder than I expected, not because I was scared, but because it meant something was real now. Something had crossed from quiet companionship to actual presence in her life. "She's 20, she added after a moment. "Sharp, fierce, protective." I nodded, still bent over the roots of a stubborn weed. Said. She looked at me then, her eyes scanning my face as if she was searching for any signs of flinching. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not," I replied, "but I meant it." She nodded once, then returned to her work. Tension didn't leave the air, but it shifted, becoming something more honest in acknowledgement of the stakes. We weren't just fixing fences anymore. We were building a bridge between her old life and whatever came next, and it scared both of us. Later that day, we started cleaning out the garage, another task that had been on her list for years. Boxes lined the back wall like tombstones of past intentions, half-finished projects, abandoned tools, a bike her daughter had long since outgrown. I noticed her pause when she lifted a small wooden crate filled with postcards. She didn't open it, just stared at it for a moment before, setting it down gently, almost like an apology. "This was supposed to be our project," she said. "We used to dream about flipping furniture together, like in those DIY shows. I didn't push. I just took the crate and stacked it neatly with the others." She looked at me then and said, "Sometimes I think she blames me for how things ended." I shook my head gently. She understand. Maybe not right away, but she will. The rest of the day passed in quiet effort. We cleared shelves, organized tools, and swept the floor until it felt less like a storage space and more like part of a home. As the sun dipped behind the trees, she leaned against the garage door and let out a long sigh. I didn't expect any of this when you first knocked on my door, she said. I was just trying to get the drain fixed. And now, her voice trailed off, and I knew the end of that sentence was more feeling than words could carry. That evening, we didn't sit on the porch. Instead, she invited me inside. The living room had changed subtly, more framed photos on the shelves, a new throw draped over the back of the couch, a candle burning with the faint scent of cedar. It felt lived in now, less like a space in waiting, and more like a place where moments happened. We sat close on the couch, the flicker of the candle casting soft shadows across the room. She pulled a blanket over her knees and rested her head lightly against my arm. You know, she said quietly, sometimes I wonder how many moments I've missed because I was waiting for someone to choose me. I didn't move. I just let the weight of her words settle. You don't have to wait anymore, I said. You've already been chosen. She didn't respond right away, but she reached for my hand and held it tightly, and that said more than any reply. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the silence between us no longer hollow, but filled with mutual recognition. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. But inside, everything was still, wrapped in the warmth of something quietly blooming. As I left that night, she walked me to the door again, this time barefoot, her steps slow and certain. At the threshold, she didn't say goodnight. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed my cheek, lingering just long enough for my breath to catch. Don't be late this weekend, she whispered. And then she smiled, not the guarded kind, not the polite kind, but the real kind. The kind that says she's still scared, but she's letting the light in anyway. I nodded, my throat tight, and walked to the truck with a heart beating louder than usual. As I drove home, I realized how far we'd come from that first day. From the clogged drain and the quiet woman who didn't trust her own voice yet, we were no longer strangers. In repair, we were something in progress, something raw and true and worth every step we'd taken. And I knew then, no matter what her daughter said, no matter how awkward or challenging the next steps might be, I wasn't going anywhere. Because when someone shows you the broken pieces and lets you stay, you don't run, you build, you stay. And you make sure they never have to unclog anything alone again. The weekend arrived with a nervous energy neither of us could fully shake. She told me her daughter Emma was coming by in the afternoon, but wouldn't give many details beyond that. When I pulled up to the house that day, the air felt thick with unspoken questions. She was waiting outside on the porch, her hands nervously twisting a scarf, eyes sharp and alert. When she saw me, there was a flicker of relief, but also something more fragile, like the moment before a test you haven't studied enough for. We spent the morning finishing some small repairs around the yard, trying to act like the day was just about a fence and some spilled paint. But the weight of the upcoming meeting hovered over every word, every smile. When the doorbell rang, I felt my heart punch my ribs with a force I hadn't expected. She took a deep breath, glanced at me with a silent thank you, then went to answer. Emma stepped inside with a sharp gaze and a stance that made it clear she was guarding herself. She was taller than I imagined, with the same dark hair as her mother, but eyes that flickered between warmth and skepticism. The air between us felt charged, as if we were all balancing on the edge of something fragile. We exchanged polite introductions, but the tension didn't break. Emma's questions came quick and pointed. What did I do for a living? How did I know her mother? What were my intentions? I answered as honestly as I could, trying not to stumble over words, aware that every sentence was being weighed and measured. Her mother watched quietly, the smallest flicker of hope crossing her face when Emma's posture softened even just a little. Over the course of the afternoon, we all circled around the edges of conversation, trying to find common ground. Emma asked about the house repairs, about the dogs, about the little moments she'd missed while growing up. There were laughs, tentative but reland moments of silence filled with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. I watched her mother carefully, noticing how she relaxed just a fraction, the walls she'd kept so high beginning to crack open. It was a quiet victory that felt like the first breath after a long swim underwater. As the sun dipped low, Emma stood up, running her hands through her hair in a way that spoke of exhaustion and a guarded tenderness. She pulled her mother aside for a moment, speaking in low tones I couldn't hear. But the change in their faces said everything. When they returned, Emma looked at me directly, her voice steady but softer than before. "I want to thank you," she said, "for being here, for helping, for being patient." The words hung between us like a fragile promise. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat because I knew what this moment meant. It wasn't about me or the repairs. It was about trust being built brick by brick in a house that had been left standing but never truly lived in. Spent the rest of the evening around the kitchen table, sharing stories and plans, laughter growing easier with every passing minute. Saw the daughter and the mother as two parts of a whole, both fighting to heal in their own ways, and I felt grateful to be a part of their story, even if just for a little while. When Emma finally left, the house felt different, fuller, warmer, like the kind of place where new memories could be made without the shadows of old ones lurking. Just out of sight, I helped her mother close the door behind her, and we stood there for a moment, neither needing to say anything. The night was quiet, except for the distant hum of cars and the soft chirping of crickets. She looked at me, eyes shimmering with tears she refused to shed. "Thank you," she whispered. I pulled her into a hug, careful and steady. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "I'm just here." And in that moment I realized something important. Fixing a drain was just the beginning. Being there for someone meant showing up through every messy, beautiful step that followed. The morning after, Emma's visit lingered in my mind long after the sun rose and cast golden streaks across the freshly painted fence. The house was quieter now, but it wasn't the emptiness that had hung over it before. This silence felt alive, filled with the echoes of conversations, laughter, and tears that had unfolded over the past few weeks. Sitting at the kitchen table, coffee steaming in my hands, I found myself gazing out at the yard, the flowers blooming brightly in the garden beds she and I had planted, the repaired fence standing sturdy and proud, the dog resting lazily in the shade. It struck me how much this place had changed, not just physically but emotionally. It was no longer just a house. It was a home, a living, breathing space where healing was happening. And somehow I felt like I was part of that, woven into its new story. The days that followed Emma's visit brought a new rhythm to our lives, one less about repairs and more about rediscovery. I arrived each morning not just with tools, but with small gifts of kindness, a fresh cup of coffee, a new plant to brighten the windowsill, or a simple smile that said, "I'm here." We moved through the house and yard together, but the projects felt less like chores and more like shared moments. We painted birdhouses and garden fences, planted herbs that would scent the kitchen, and fixed creaky floorboards that had long been ignored. The dog became my constant companion too, following me from one task to the next, its eyes bright with approval and its tail wagging in silent cheer. Watching her laugh as she learned to hold a paintbrush or use a hammer with trembling confidence was a reminder that healing is messy but beautiful, and that sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch, we sat together wrapped in blankets, sipping tea, and watching the world slowly change colors. She turned to me quietly, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the twilight. "I never thought I'd feel this alive again," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything I've been through." Her words hung heavy in the air, layered with pain, but also a fragile hope that I recognized immediately. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth and tremble beneath her skin. "You deserve to feel alive," I said gently. "More than that, you deserve happiness, true happiness." The smile she gave me then was one of raw honesty, the kind that shines through years of hurt and slowly begins to mend the cracks. In that moment, everything felt possible. The transformation wasn't just in the house or the garden, it was in her. I watched as she grew stronger, more confident, and more willing to embrace life's imperfections. She told me stories of the past, some filled with laughter, others with sorrow, and I listened, offering only my presence and understanding. There was no rush to fix what wasn't broken, No pressure to move faster than she was ready for.
Just
Steady companionship. Some days she would disappear into her memories, her eyes clouded with pain. But I stayed with her through it all, knowing that healing is not a straight path, but a winding road. She taught me more about resilience than any manual or tool could. And in return, I offered a space where she could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. We also spent many evenings talking about the future, the dreams she'd tucked away, the hopes she still nurtured quietly. She confided that after years of feeling invisible in her own life, the idea of starting over was terrifying yet exhilarating. Together we mapped out small steps plans to travel, to learn new skills, to reconnect with old friends. The fence we fixed became a metaphor for those boundaries she was ready to set in her life, protecting her newfound peace and happiness. I was honored to be part of her journey, not just as a handyman, but as a witness to her courage and growth. Every laugh, every tear, every quiet moment we shared was a stitch in the fabric of something new, something stronger. Months passed, and with each visit, the house and the woman inside it blossomed. Emma's visits became more frequent and joyful, her laughter filling rooms that had once been silent. The bond between mother and daughter healed slowly, tentatively, but it grew roots that promised to hold strong. I saw them share stories, cook meals, and create memories that would last a lifetime. The dog, once wary, now bounded between the two of us, a living bridge of love and loyalty. I was no longer just the man who unclogged drains or fixed fences. I had become part of a family, part of a story that was still being written. Day by day, one cool autumn evening, as we sat on the porch swing we'd built from reclaimed wood, she looked out over the garden, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. "I used to think fixing things was just about making them work again," she said thoughtfully. "But now I realize it's so much more. It's about giving things a chance to be better, to be stronger, to be alive." Her words resonated deeply with me. Sometimes, I added, it's about fixing the parts of ourselves that we thought were beyond repair. She smiled, eyes glistening with tears she didn't try to hide. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady but full of emotion, "for everything." "No," I said softly, squeezing her hand. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." I thought often about that first Datha call about the clogged drain. The hesitant voice on the other end of the line, the guarded eyes that looked at me with a mixture of skepticism and need. I remembered the loneliness she carried, the years of feeling invisible, the quiet resignation that had settled into her home like dust on forgotten shelves. And I marveled at the courage it took for her to open her door, to let me see her brokenness without judgment. That act of trust had changed everything, not just for her, but for me as well. It reminded me why I did this work, why fixing things wasn't just about repairs or tools, but about hearts and hope. It taught me about patience, kindness, and the power of simply showing up. Of course, not every day was easy. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, when the shadows of the past threatened to undo all the progress. There were nights when tears came unbidden, when the weight of everything felt crushing. But those moments were met with compassion from her, from Emma, and from me. We learned to lean on each other, to communicate honestly, to hold space for pain without trying to erase it. The friendship we built was a sanctuary, a place where vulnerability was welcomed and healing could happen slowly, gently, without pressure or expectation. I realized then that the most important repairs are often invisible. They happen inside the heart, in the quiet moments between words. As I sit here now writing this story, I carry her with me. I carry the memory of her voice telling me she was 44 and her husband never fixed anything. I carry the image of her standing on the porch, tentative but hopeful, reaching out for something new. And I carry deep gratitude for the trust she placed in me, not just as a handyman, but as a witness to her journey toward healing and wholeness. This story isn't really about me. It's about her bravery, her resilience, and the power of connection to mend even the deepest wounds. It's about how sometimes, when you show up to fix a simple drain, you end up helping someone unclog years of pain and find a way to breathe freely again. And that, I believe, It's the real repair, the one that lasts. After the transformation inside the house and the newfound rhythm of our days, there came a moment when I realized my role had shifted once again. Not just a handyman or a quiet companion, but someone who had become intertwined with the fabric of their lives. The boundaries between client and friend blurred into something richer and more complex. One chilly morning, as we were clearing leaves from the garden paths, she paused, looked up at the sky, and said quietly, "I'm starting to believe in second chances." The weight behind those words was unmistakable, a past filled with disappointment, and a future that finally felt within reach. I nodded, understanding that hope was no longer just a fragile idea, but a tangible force in her life. Over time, I learned more about the depth of what she'd endured, the years of quiet suffering alongside a husband who never lifted a finger to fix anything, literal or emotional. The loneliness, the self-doubt, the silent endurance of a life half-lived. But I also saw the incredible strength she carried beneath it, all a reservoir of resilience that had never truly run dry. That strength was what helped her pick up the pieces and begin again, piece by piece, day by day. And it was that strength I witnessed grow every time she smiled with genuine joy or embraced her daughter without reservation. These moments, so ordinary yet profound, reminded me that healing is rarely dramatic, but always transformative. One evening after dinner, we sat by the fire pit in the backyard, the flames crackling softly in the cool air. She looked at me with a softness that was new, a quiet trust that said, without words, that this was home now. We talked about the future, not just the projects around the house, but the dreams that had been shelved for too long. Travel, new hobbies, reconnecting with old friends, maybe even love again. It was a conversation filled with possibility, not fear. Watching her speak of these things with hope in her voice, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude that I had been invited to witness this rebirth, share in the quiet miracles of everyday life. Reflecting on all of this, I realize how much this journey taught me about the human spirit, the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, and the courage to open up and let someone in, the slow but steady rebuilding of trust. Fixing a drain was only the beginning. The real work was the emotional unclogging, the clearing away of years of hurt, the making space for new life to flow. This experience reaffirmed for me that sometimes the most meaningful work isn't with tools or materials, but with empathy and presence. That showing up, listening, and simply being there can be the greatest gift. Now, as I prepare to leave this chapter behind, I carry with me the lessons and the memories. She taught me that no matter how broken something or someone may seem, there is always a chance for renewal. There is always hope. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to care, to stay, and to help hold the light until the darkness fades. This story, this shared journey, has left its mark on me. I hope in some small way it touches you, reminding you that healing is possible, that connection matters, and that every ending is just the start of something new. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.